said it produces the same effect as 2 bottles of Corton, though perhaps less agreeable to swallow. Then, passing his hand several times across his forehead, and rubbing his temples, he called in a firm voice, "Nicole, Barbicane." He waited anxiously, no answer, not even a sigh to show that the hearts of his companions were still beating. He called again, the same silence. "The devil," he exclaimed, "they look as if they had fallen from a 5th story on their heads, bah." He added, with that imperturbable confidence, which nothing could check. "If a Frenchman can get on his knees, 2 Americans ought to be able to get on their feet, but first let us light up." Arden felt the tide of life return by degrees. His blood became calm, and returned to its accustomed circulation. Another effort restored his equilibrium. He succeeded in rising, drew a match from his pocket, and approaching the burner lighted it. The receiver had not suffered at all. The gas had not escaped. Besides, the smell would have betrayed it. And in that case Michel Arden could not have carried a lighted match with impunity through the space filled with hydrogen. The gas mixing with the air would have produced a detonating mixture, and the explosion would have finished what the shock had perhaps begun. When the burner was lit, Arden leaned over the bodies of his companions. They were lying one on the other, and in it mass, Nicole above, Barbicane underneath. Arden lifted the captain, propped him up against the divan, and began to rub vigorously. This means, used with judgment, restored Nicole, who opened his eyes, and instantly recovering his presence of mind, seized Arden's hand, and looked around him. "And, Barbicane," said he. "Each in turn," replied Michel Arden. "I began with you, Nicole, because you were on the top. Now let us look to Barbicane," saying which Arden and Nicole raised the president of the gun club, and laid him on the divan. He seemed to have suffered more than either of his companions. He was bleeding, but Nicole was reassured by finding that the hemorrhage came from a slight wound on the shoulder, a mere graze, which he bound up carefully. Still, Barbicane was a long time coming to himself, which frightened his friends, who did not spare friction. "He breathes though," said Nicole, putting his ear to the chest of the wounded man. "Yes," replied Arden, "he breathes like a man who has some notion of that daily operation. Rub, Nicole. Let us rub harder." And the 2 improvised practitioners worked so hard, and so well that Barbicane recovered his senses. He opened his eyes, sat up, took his 2 friends by the hands, and his first words were, "Nicole, are we moving?" Nicole and Arden looked at each other. They had not yet troubled themselves about the projectile. Their first thought had been for the traveler, not for the car. "Well, are we really moving?" repeated Michel Arden. "Or quietly resting on the soil of Florida?" asked Nicole. "Or at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico?" added Michel Arden. "What an idea!" exclaimed the president. And this double hypothesis suggested by his companions had the effect of recalling him to his senses. In any case, they could not decide on the position of the projectile, its apparent movability, and the want of communication with the outside prevented them from solving the question. Perhaps the projectile was unwinding its course through space. Perhaps after a short rise, it had fallen upon the earth. Or even in the Gulf of Mexico, a fall which the narrowness of the peninsula of Florida would render not impossible. The case was serious, the problem interesting, and one that must be solved as soon as possible. Thus, highly excited, Barbicane's moral energy triumphed over physical weakness, and he rose to his feet. He listened. Outside was perfect silence. But the thick padding was enough to intercept all sounds coming from the earth. But one circumstance struck Barbicane, viz., that the temperature inside the projectile was singularly high, the president drew a thermometer from its case and consulted it. The instrument showed 81 Fahr. "Yes," he exclaimed, "yes, we are moving." This stifling heat, penetrating through the partitions of the projectile, is produced by its friction on the atmospheric strata. It will soon diminish, because we are already floating in space, and after having nearly stifled, we shall have to suffer intense cold. "What?" said Michel Ardan. "According to your showing, Barbicane, we are already beyond the limits of the terrestrial atmosphere." "Without a doubt, Michel, listen to me. It is 55 minutes past 10. We have been gone about 8 minutes, and if our initiatory speed has not been checked by the friction, 6 seconds would be enough for us to pass through the 40 miles of atmosphere which surrounds the globe." "Just so," replied Nickel, "but in what proportion do you estimate the diminution of speed by friction?" "In the proportion of 1/3, Nickel. This diminution is considerable, but according to my calculations it is nothing less. If, then, we had an initiatory speed of 12,000 yards, on leaving the atmosphere, this speed would be reduced to 9,165 yards. In any case, we have already passed through this interval, and then," said Michel Ardan, "friend Nickel has lost his two bets, $4,000, because the Columbiad did not burst, $5,000, because the projectile has risen more than 6 miles. Now, Nickel, pay up." "Let us prove it first," said the captain, "and we will pay afterward. It is quite possible that Barbicane's reasoning is correct, and that I have lost my $9,000, but a new hypothesis presents itself to my mind, and it annuls the wager." "What is that?" asked Barbicane quickly. "The hypothesis that, for some reason or other, fire was never set to the powder, and we have not started at all." "My goodness, Captain," exclaimed Michel Ardan, "that hypothesis is not worthy of my brain. It cannot be a serious one, for have we not been half annihilated by the shock? Did I not recall you to life? Is not the president's shoulder still bleeding from the blow it has received?" "Granted," replied Nickel, "but one question." "Well, Captain, did you hear the detonation, which certainly ought to be loud?" "No," replied Ardan, much surprised. "Certainly I did not hear the detonation." "And you, Barbicane?" "Nor I either." "Very well," said Nickel. "Well now," murmured the president, "why did we not hear the detonation?" The three friends looked at each other with a disconcerted air. It was quite an inexplicable phenomenon. The projectile had started, and consequently there must have been a detonation. "Let us first find out where we are," said Barbicane, "and let down this panel." This very simple operation was soon accomplished. The nuts which held the bolts to the outer plates of the right-hand scuttle gave way under the pressure of the English wrench. These bolts were pushed outside, and the buffers covered with India rubber stopped up the holes, which let them through. Immediately the outer plate fell back upon its hinges like a porthole, and the lenticular glass, which closed the scuttle, appeared. A similar one was let into the thick partition on the opposite side of the projectile, another in the top of the dome, and finally a fourth in the middle of the base. They could therefore make observations in 4 different directions: the firmament by the side and most direct windows, the earth or the moon by the upper and under openings in the projectile. Barbicane and his 2 companions immediately rushed to the uncovered window, but it was lit by no ray of light. Profound darkness surrounded them, which, however, did not prevent the president from exclaiming, No, my friends, we have not fallen back upon the earth. No, nor are we submerged in the Gulf of Mexico. Yes, we are mounting into space. See those stars shining in the night, and that impenetrable darkness heaped up between the earth and us. Hurrah, hurrah, exclaimed Michel Ardan and Nicole in one voice. Indeed, this thick darkness proved that the projectile had left the earth, for the soil, brilliantly lit by the moon beams, would have been visible to the travelers if they had been lying on its surface. This darkness also showed that the projectile had passed the atmospheric strata, for the diffused light spread in the air would have been reflected on the metal walls, which reflection was wanting. This light would have lit the window, and the window was dark. Doubt was no longer possible. The travelers had left the earth. I have lost, said Nicole. I congratulate you, replied Ardan. Here are the $9,000, said the captain, drawing a roll of paper dollars from his pocket. Will you have a receipt for it? Asked Barbicane, taking the sum. If you do not mind, answered Nicole. It is more business-like. And coolly and seriously, as if he had been at his strong box, the president drew forth his notebook, tore out a blank leaf, wrote a proper receipt in pencil, dated, and signed it with the usual flourish, and gave it to the captain, who carefully placed it in his pocketbook. Michel Ardan, taking off his hat, bowed to his two companions without speaking. So much formality under such circumstances left him speechless. He had never before seen anything so American. This is a purely French habit. This affair settled, Barbicane and Nicole had returned to the window and were watching the constellations. The stars looked like bright points on the black sky, but from that side, they could not see the orb of night, which traveling from east to west would rise by degrees toward the zenith. Its absence drew the following remark from Ardan. And the moon, will she perchance fail at our rendezvous? Do not alarm yourself, said Barbicane. Our future globe is at its post, but we cannot see her from this side. Let us open the other. As Barbicane was about leaving the window to open the opposite scuttle, his attention was attracted by the approach of a brilliant object. It was an enormous disk, whose colossal dimension could not be estimated. Its face, which was turned to the earth, was very bright. One might have thought it a small moon, reflecting the light of the large one. She advanced with great speed, and seemed to describe an orbit round the earth, which would intersect the passage of the projectile. This body revolved upon its axis, and exhibited the phenomena of all celestial bodies abandoned in space. "Ah!" exclaimed Michel Ardan, "what is that? Another projectile?" Barbicane did not answer. The appearance of this enormous body surprised and troubled him. A collision was possible, and might be attended with deplorable results. Either the projectile would deviate from its path, or a shock, breaking its impetus, might precipitate it to earth. Or, lastly, it might be irresistibly drawn away by the powerful asteroid. The president caught at a glance the consequences of these three hypotheses, either of which would, one way or the other, bring their experiment to an unsuccessful and fatal termination. His companions stood silently looking into space. The object grew rapidly as it approached them, and by an optical illusion, the projectile seemed to be throwing itself before it. "By Jove!" exclaimed Michel Ardan, "we shall run into one another." Instinctively the travelers drew back. Their dread was great, but it did not last many seconds. The asteroid passed several hundred yards from the projectile and disappeared, not so much from the rapidity of its course, as that its face being opposite the moon, it was suddenly merged into the perfect darkness of space. "A happy journey to you," exclaimed Michel Ardan, with a sigh of relief. "Surely infinity of space is large enough for a poor little projectile to walk through without fear. Now, what is this portentous glow which nearly struck us?" "I know," replied Barbicane. "Oh, indeed, you know everything." "It is," said Barbicane, "a simple meteorite, but an enormous one, which the attraction of the Earth has retained as a satellite." "Is it possible?" exclaimed Michel Ardan. "The Earth then has two moons like Neptune?" "Yes, my friends, two moons, though it passes generally for having only one. But this second moon is so small, and its speed so great, that the inhabitants of the Earth cannot see it. It was by noticing disturbances that a French astronomer, M. Petit, was able to determine the existence of this second satellite and calculate its elements according to his observations. This meteorite will accomplish its revolution around the Earth in 3 hours and 20 minutes, which implies a wonderful rate of speed. Do all astronomers admit the existence of this satellite?" asked Nicole. "No," replied Barbicane, "but if, like us, they had met it, they could no longer doubt it. Indeed, I think that this meteorite, which, had it struck the projectile, would have much embarrassed us, will give us the means of deciding what our position in space is." "How?" said Ardan. "Because its distance is known, and when we met it, we were exactly 4,650 miles from the surface of the terrestrial globe." "More than 2,000 French leagues," exclaimed Michel Ardan. "That beats the express trains of the pitiful globe called the Earth." "I should think so," replied Nicole, consulting his chronometer. "It is 11 o'clock, and it is only 13 minutes since we left the American continent." "Only 13 minutes," said Barbicane. "Yes," said Nicole, "and if our initiatory speed of 12,000 yards has been kept up, we shall have made about 20,000 miles in the hour." "That is all very well, my friends," said the President, "but the insoluble question still remains. Why did we not hear the detonation of the Columbiad?" For want of an answer, the conversation dropped, and Barbicane began thoughtfully to let down the shutter of the second side. He succeeded, and through the uncovered glass, the moon filled the projectile with a brilliant light. Nicole, as an economical man, put out the gas, now useless, and whose brilliancy prevented any observation of the interplanetary space. The lunar disk shone with wonderful purity. Her rays, no longer filtered through the vapory atmosphere of the terrestrial globe, shone through the glass, filling the air in the interior of the projectile with silvery reflections. The black curtain of the firmament, in reality, heightened the moon's brilliancy, which in this void of ether unfavorable to diffusion, did not eclipse the neighboring stars. The heavens, thus seen, presented quite a new aspect, and one which the human eye could never dream of. One may conceive the interest with which these bold men watched the orb of night, the great aim of their journey. In its motion, the Earth's satellite was insensibly nearing the zenith, the mathematical point, which it ought to attain 96 hours later. Her mountains, her plains, every projection was as clearly discernible to their eyes, as if they were observing it from some spot upon the Earth. But its light was developed through space with wonderful intensity. The disk shone like a platinum mirror of the Earth flying from under their feet. The travelers had lost all recollection. It was Captain Nicole who first recalled their attention to the vanishing globe. Yes, said Michel Arden, do not let us be ungrateful to it. Since we are leaving our country, let our last looks be directed to it. I wish to see the earth once more before it is quite hidden from my eyes. To satisfy his companions, Barbicane began to uncover the window at the bottom of the projectile, which would allow them to observe the earth direct. The disk, which the force of the projection had beaten down to the base, was removed, not without difficulty. Its fragments, placed carefully against a wall, might serve again upon occasion. Then a circular gap appeared, 19 inches in diameter, hollowed out of the lower part of the projectile. A glass cover, 6 inches thick, and strengthened with upper fastenings, closed it tightly. Beneath was fixed an aluminum plate, held in place by bolts. The screws being undone, and the bolts let go, the plate fell down, and visible communication was established between the interior and the exterior. Michel Arden knelt by the glass. It was cloudy, seemingly opaque. Well, he exclaimed, and the earth? The earth, said Barbicane, there it is. What, that little thread, that silver crescent? Doubtless, Michel, in 4 days, when the moon will be full, at the very time we shall reach it, the earth will be new, and will only appear to us as a slender crescent, which will soon disappear, and for some days will be enveloped in utter darkness. That the earth, repeated Michel Arden, looking with all his eyes at the thin slip of his native planet. The explanation given by President Barbicane was correct. The earth, with respect to the projectile, was entering its last phase. It was in its octant, and showed a crescent finely traced on the dark background of the sky. Its light, rendered bluish by the thick strata of the atmosphere, was less intense than that of the crescent moon, but it was of considerable dimensions, and looked like an enormous arch stretched across the firmament, some parts brilliantly lighted, especially on its concave part, showed the presence of high mountains, often disappearing behind thick spots, which are never seen on the lunar disk. They were rings of clouds, placed concentrically round the terrestrial globe. While the travelers were trying to pierce the profound darkness, a brilliant cluster of shooting stars burst upon their eyes. Hundreds of meteorites, ignited by the friction of the atmosphere, irradiated the shadow of the luminous train, and lined the cloudy parts of the disk with their fire. At this period the earth was in its perihelion, and the month of December is so propitious to these shooting stars that astronomers have counted as many as 24,000 in an hour. But Michel Arden, disdaining scientific reasonings, preferred thinking that the earth was thus saluting the departure of her 3 children with her most brilliant fireworks. Indeed, this was all they saw of the globe, lost in the solar world, rising and setting to the great planets, like a simple morning or evening star. This globe, where they had left all their affections, was nothing more than a fugitive crescent. Long did the 3 friends look without speaking, though united in heart, while the projectile sped onward with an ever-decreasing speed. Then an irresistible drowsiness crept over their brain. Was it weariness of body and mind? No doubt, for after the overexcitement of those last hours passed upon earth, reaction was inevitable. Well, said Nicholl, since we must sleep, let us sleep. And stretching themselves on their couches, they were all 3 soon in a profound slumber. But they had not forgotten themselves more than a quarter of an hour, when Barbicane sat up suddenly, and rousing his companions with a loud voice, exclaimed, I have found it. What have you found? Asked Michel Arden, jumping from his bed. The reason why we did not hear the detonation of the Columbiad? And it is, said Nicholl, Because our projectile traveled faster than the sound. CHAPTER3 THEIRPLACOF Shelter. This curious but certainly correct explanation once given, the three friends returned to their slumbers. Could they have found a calmer or more peaceful spot to sleep in? On the earth, houses, towns, cottages, and country feel every shock given to the exterior of the globe. On sea, the vessels rocked by the waves are still in motion. In the air, the balloon oscillates incessantly on the fluid strata of diverse densities. This projectile alone, floating in perfect space, in the midst of perfect silence, offered perfect repose. Thus the sleep of our adventurous travelers might have been indefinitely prolonged, if an unexpected noise had not awakened them, at about 7 o'clock in the morning of the 2nd of December, 8 hours after their departure. This noise was a very natural barking. "The dogs, it is the dogs," exclaimed Michel Ardan, rising at once. "They are hungry," said Nicole. "By Jove," replied Michel, "we have forgotten them." "Where are they?" asked Barbicane. They looked and found one of the animals, crouched under the divan, terrified and shaken by the initiatory shock. It had remained in the corner till its voice returned with the pangs of hunger. It was the amiable Diana, still very confused, who crept out of her retreat, though not without much persuasion, Michel Ardan encouraging her with most gracious words. "Come, Diana," said he, "come, my girl. Thou whose destiny will be marked in the cynegetic annals. Thou whom the pagans would have given as companion to the god Anubis, and Christians as friend to Saint Roch. Thou who art rushing into interplanetary space, and wilt perhaps be the eve of all Selenite dogs. Come, Diana, come here." Diana, flattered or not, advanced by degrees, uttering plaintive cries. "Good," said Barbicane, "I see Eve, but where is Adam?" "Adam," replied Michel, "Adam cannot be far off. He is there somewhere. We must call him Satellite." "Here, Satellite." But Satellite did not appear. Diana would not leave off howling. They found, however, that she was not bruised, and they gave her a pie, which silenced her complaints. As to Satellite, he seemed quite lost. They had to hunt a long time before finding him in one of the upper compartments of the projectile, whither some unaccountable shock must have violently hurled him. The poor beast, much hurt, was in a piteous state. "The devil," said Michel. They brought the unfortunate dog down with great care. Its skull had been broken against the roof, and it seemed unlikely that he could recover from such a shock. Meanwhile, he was stretched comfortably on a cushion. Once there, he heaved a sigh. "We will take care of you," said Michel. "We are responsible for your existence. I would rather lose an arm than a paw of my poor Satellite." Saying which, he offered some water to the wounded dog, who swallowed it with avidity. This attention paid, the travelers watched the earth and the moon attentively. The earth was now only discernible by a cloudy disk ending in a crescent, rather more contracted than that of the previous evening. But its expanse was still enormous, compared with that of the moon, which was approaching nearer and nearer to a perfect circle. "By Jove," said Michel Ardan, "I am really sorry that we did not start when the earth was full, that is to say, when our globe was in opposition to the sun." "Why," said Nicole, "because we should have seen our continents and seas in a new light, first resplendent under the solar rays, the latter cloudy as represented on some maps of the world, I should like to have seen those poles of the earth, on which the eye of man has never yet rested. I dare say, replied Barbicane, but if the earth had been full, the moon would have been new. That is to say, invisible, because of the rays of the sun. It is better for us to see the destination we wish to reach than the point of departure. You are right, Barbicane, replied Captain Nicholl. And, besides, when we have reached the moon, we shall have time during the long lunar nights to consider at our leisure the globe on which our likenesses swarm. Our likenesses, exclaimed Michel Ardan, they are no more our likenesses than the Selenites are. We inhabit a new world, peopled by our selvest projectile. I am Barbicane's likeness, and Barbicane is Nicholl's. Beyond us, around us, human nature is at an end, and we are the only population of this microcosm until we become pure Selenites. In about 88 hours, replied the captain. Which means to say, asked Michel Ardan. That it is 8:30, replied Nicholl. Very well, retorted Michel. Then it is impossible for me to find even the shadow of a reason why we should not go to breakfast. Indeed, the inhabitants of the new star could not live without eating, and their stomachs were suffering from the imperious laws of hunger. Michel Ardan, as a Frenchman, was declared chief cook, an important function which raised no rival. The gas gave sufficient heat for the culinary apparatus, and the provision box furnished the elements of this first feast. The breakfast began with 3 bowls of excellent soup, thanks to the liquefaction in hot water of those precious cakes of Liebig, prepared from the best parts of the ruminants of the Pampas. To the soup succeeded some beasts, compressed by an hydraulic press, as tender and succulent as if brought straight from the kitchen of an English eating-house. Michel, who was imaginative, maintained that they were even red. Preserved vegetables fresher than nature, said the amiable Michel, succeeded the dish of meat, and was followed by some cups of tea with bread and butter after the American fashion. The beverage was declared exquisite, and was due to the infusion of the choicest leaves, of which the Emperor of Russia had given some chests, for the benefit of the travelers. And lastly, to crown the repast, Ardan had brought out a fine bottle of Newts, which was found by chance in the provision box. The 3 friends drank to the union of the earth and her satellite. And, as if he had not already done enough for the generous wine, which he had distilled on the slopes of Burgundy, the sun chose to be part of the party. At this moment the projectile emerged from the conical shadow cast by the terrestrial globe, and the rays of the radiant orb struck the lower disk of the projectile, direct occasioned by the angle which the moon's orbit makes with that of the earth. The sun, exclaimed Michel Ardan. No doubt, replied Barbicane, I expected it. But, said Michel, the conical shadow, which the earth leaves in space, extends beyond the moon. Far beyond it, if the atmospheric refraction is not taken into consideration, said Barbicane, but when the moon is enveloped in this shadow, it is because the centers of the 3 stars, the sun, the earth, and the moon, are all in one and the same straight line. Then the nodes coincide with the phases of the moon. And there is an eclipse. If we had started when there was an eclipse of the moon, all our passage would have been in the shadow, which would have been a pity. Why? Because, though we are floating in space, our projectile, bathed in the solar rays, will receive light and heat. It economizes the gas, which is in every respect a good economy. Indeed, under these rays, which no atmosphere can temper, either in temperature or brilliancy, the projectile grew warm and bright, as if it had passed suddenly from winter to summer, The moon above, the sun beneath, were inundating it with their fire. "It is pleasant here," said Nickel. "I should think so," said Michel Ardan. "With a little earth spread on our aluminum planet, we should have green peas in 24 hours. I have but one fear, which is that the walls of the projectile might melt." "Calm yourself, my worthy friend," replied Barbicane. "The projectile withstood a very much higher temperature than this as it slid through the strata of the atmosphere. I should not be surprised if it did not look like a meteor on fire to the eyes of the spectators in Florida." "But then J.T. Maston will think we are roasted." "What astonishes me," said Barbicane, "is that we have not been. That was a danger we had not provided for." "I feared it," said Nickel simply. "And you never mentioned it, my sublime captain," exclaimed Michel Ardan, clasping his friend's hand. Barbicane now began to settle himself in the projectile, as if he was never to leave it. One must remember that this aerial car had a base with a superficies of 54 square feet. Its height to the roof was 12 feet. Carefully laid out in the inside, and little encumbered by instruments and traveling utensils, which each had their particular place, it left the three travelers a certain freedom of movement. The thick window inserted in the bottom could bear any amount of weight, and Barbicane and his companions walked upon it as if it were solid plank. But the sun striking it directly, with its rays lit the interior of the projectile from beneath, thus producing singular effects of light. They began by investigating the state of their store of water and provisions, neither of which had suffered, thanks to the care taken to deaden the shock. Their provisions were abundant, and plentiful enough to last the three travelers for more than a year.